Hello and welcome to Must Read Fiction, a place for people who know that life is better with a novel in hand. I'm Erin Popelka, and I'm so delighted to be here today with author Marco Rafalà. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Marco Rafalà is a first-generation Sicilian-American novelist, musician, and writer for award-winning tabletop role-playing games. He earned his MFA in fiction from the New School and is a co-curator of the Guerrilla Lit Reading Series in New York City. Born in Middletown, Connecticut, he now lives in Brooklyn, New York. His fiction and nonfiction have appeared in Bellevue Literary Review and Literary Hub. His debut novel, How Fires End, which I have here in my hands, this fantastic book, is a finalist for the Connecticut Book Award. So, Marco, thank you so very much for being with us. And let's start with How Fires End. Please tell me about the book.
So How Fires End is a Sicilian-American family saga inspired by my father's stories of his life in Sicily during and after the Second World War. In the novel, a vendetta and a curse follow two families from a hillside village in World War II Sicily to an Italian-American community in Connecticut in the 1980s. Though I grew up listening to my father's stories, the idea of writing this novel didn't occur to me until I took a trip to Sicily with him in 2001. And being in Melilli, Sicily, and that's the village where my father grew up, walking the same cobblestone streets that he had spoken about and sitting under the tree that he sat under as a boy, and visiting the graves of his cousins who died in 1943 playing with a unexploded piece of ordnance, and seeing the caves that my family hid in during the war. Throughout all of that, I found the answer to a question I didn't even know to ask, which is, what is a Sicilian-American story that's not about the mafia? And it's about the people of a small, close-knit community, very much like Melilli, the ordinary working class and poor people whose lives were upended by the war, and how they came to the United States to make a new life for themselves, and while at the same time carrying their homelands with them. And it's about their children who straddle the question of what it means to be an American and what it means to be a Sicilian, and how you reconcile those two halves, and what do you do with the weight of your parents' personal histories. So from that heavy experience that I had, characters grew and the story started to take shape. So that's sort of the backstory of where the novel came from.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. Well, thank you for sharing that. I can definitely feel kind of the weight of that history as you talk about going to Sicily, as you talk about sort of exploring these characters. Just fascinating. And so as I was preparing for this interview, I read that you like to write organically and to kind of allow your characters a little bit of space. So as you were writing How Fires End, was there something that surprised you in the writing of the book? Or do you have a favorite character that maybe surprised you, or an unexpected situation that emerged?
Yeah, so the novel is told from the perspectives of three first-person narrators and one third-person narrator. And that was never my original intention when I started writing the book. But I found that I needed to let the story reveal what it needed to be, sort of without my trying to push it into a certain direction. And that's probably why it also took me 10 years to finish it. But I began writing the novel from the perspective of Salvatore as a young boy in the village of Melilli during the Second World War. And the very first scene that I wrote, which is now, I think, in like the middle of the book, is from his perspective, in his voice, in 1943, the moment where he sees his brothers die playing with an unexploded shell. And for a long time, I thought that was my opening. That was chapter one. That was like a hell of an opening. And that Salvatore would be my one narrator and I would follow him through the course of his life. But then as I kept writing, I got to this point where I realized that there was more to the story that Salvatore didn't know or couldn't tell. He just couldn't emotionally, couldn't feel comfortable telling. So that's when I started writing from the perspective of his American-born son, and the setting shifted to Middletown, Connecticut in the 1980s. And then the other narratives grew from this slow realization that these characters each had a piece of the story to tell. I don't have a favorite character. I love them all equally. But Salvatore's sister, Nella, really surprised me in the writing of the book. And without giving too much away, one of the most unexpected moments for me as I was writing it was a young Nella's role in a pivotal moment where the family decides to answer violence with violence. And that moment happened very late in the writing process, but it was interesting to see how it made sense with who she was and scenes that took place later in her life, but that I had written much, much earlier. And in that moment, Nella bought into the idea of machismo, and it haunted her for the rest of her life in a way that it didn't haunt her brother. And I think that was also why it was important that she opened the book and closed the book, because she understands machismo from an insider and an outsider perspective, and she knows how destructive it is.
Yeah, and that's actually a really perfect segue into my next question, which is that as I was preparing for this interview, I saw that you talked about getting high praise from a reader. And I quote from the reader, the writing does justice to that complex combination of violence and vulnerability in Sicilian masculinity, just one of its many feats. And so that was a quote from a reader about How Fires End. And I would love to just hear a little bit more about this. Can you speak more about that violence and vulnerability in Sicilian masculinity, and what drew you to explore this in the book? And what is it about Sicily that seems to cultivate this combination?
Sure. So exploring ideas of Sicilian masculinity or machismo, it came from a very personal place for me. Like I said, my father was born in Sicily. He immigrated to the United States when he was 29 years old, and he carried both strict Sicilian cultural traditions and childhood war trauma, and both of which shaped me in ways that, as an adult, I'm still understanding. But growing up as a kid, I didn't fit into this neat box of what masculinity was supposed to look like, especially in a very macho Sicilian-American community. And I felt a sense of disapproval and rejection because of that. When other boys were outside playing soccer or roughhousing, I was inside reading a book or playing Dungeons and Dragons with other nerds like myself. So I began with that perspective, especially for David, that feeling of never being able to live up to a particular cultural idea of masculinity, which then grew into trying to understand where does that come from. And how it holds people hostage. And what came out of that was a much deeper understanding for me of how machismo and violence are intertwined. When I was younger, most of the Sicilian men in my life only knew how to express anger and fear. And they were shaped by the traumas that they carried, but more importantly, by their inability to process or deal with those traumas, which is where machismo plays a role, I think, because in the idea of manliness for a Sicilian male, at least of my father's generation, life is a constant struggle that they're expected to endure in order to take care of their families and protect their honor. And it's a familial obligation, and family and loyalty to family is at the center of Sicilian life. And I mean family with a lowercase f, not like family as in The Godfather. And there's also this idea of omerta, the code of silence. And that's something that in America we know about from watching The Godfather and movies and television shows about the mafia. But it's really a much older, broader cultural tradition that stems from a deep mistrust of governmental authority and outsiders, which speaks to Sicily's long, violent history of invasion and occupation by foreign powers. So if you take the weight of all of that history and then you add the weight of unresolved childhood war trauma, how are you supposed to have healthy relationships with anyone? If you can only express anger and fear, how can you express love? And one answer which I found in the process of writing the book, and my editor helped me articulate and really bring out, is that men like my father express love to their children by teaching them how to survive in the world without them. So in the novel, Salvatore tries to teach his son David how to care for a vegetable garden. And that's the most fundamental survival skill, growing your own food. If you know how to do that, you'll always have food on the table, no matter how apocalyptic it is outside, right? And it's something that my father did for me and for my older brother. You know, at the time, it felt like punishment, standing outside, watching him work in the garden, and listening to him explain what he was doing and why. But I can see now, I can see it differently now through the eyes of my character, Salvatore. And I think that goes back to that experience that I had in Sicily with him, where I was able to go past him as a parental figure and you know, get beyond this sort of contentious relationship that we had, and see him as just a person with all of this baggage that really wasn't his fault. And it really, that experience really humanized him, and I think enabled me to explore all of these issues that I was struggling with myself.
Yeah, and I think writing, and especially writing fiction, and I know for me as a reader too, reading fiction offers such a good way to sort of explore some of those things that are maybe like a couple levels below the surface and below daily life. And so I imagine it was really interesting to sort of revisit, your experiences with your father and your experiences in Sicily, and to do that through the lens of fiction, you know, to be able to try it on in a way that was maybe a little less personal, but also maybe a little deeper. So
right, exactly.
Yeah.
It gave me permission to go to those sort of frightening or scary places that I wouldn't normally have gone to in my daily life or in any other kind of creative endeavor.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Thank you for making that journey so that we could also learn from your process. So thank you. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. And another piece that I was hoping to speak about is in your bio. So you also are a co-curator of the Guerrilla Lit Reading Series. And so speaking about great work that helps others, can you tell me a little bit more about the Guerrilla Lit Reading Series and how it started and how it has evolved?
Sure. So the Guerrilla Lit Reading Series, I co-founded it with fellow writers I met in the New School's MFA program. And our original inspiration was to just maintain and foster that sense of community that we had in the program. And over the years, it evolved from a place where friends gathered at a bar to share and talk about their work, to an actual series where established writers and emerging writers are sharing the same stage. But in this time of COVID-19, we've transitioned to holding virtual events on Zoom. And in the spring, I worried about our attendance in that new environment. We were in lockdown here in New York City. Personally, my mother was in quarantine in Connecticut, sick with COVID. And the last thing I wanted to do was think about a reading series or attend a virtual event or socialize with people. You know, I was just a basket case. And I assumed everyone else was in that same boat. You know, they had that same level of emotional exhaustion. But we ended up doubling the attendance that we normally get in our in-person events. And that's when I realized that people needed the reading series to adapt and survive the pandemic. And that I needed it too. That sense of community was really healing.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for doing that work. And certainly I have found that, yeah, that in this moment of COVID-19, that virtual space, it is limiting in many ways that we can't be in the same room with each other
Yeah,
and share the same air and get a drink together. But it's like, oh, if I'm doing something, like I can invite my parents from the other side of the state, like I can invite aunts and uncles who are across the
right.
country, and so it does actually quite broaden, like, oh, how many people can join something that maybe they wouldn't have otherwise. So how great that that's been the case for your reading series.
Right. Yeah. It's sort of like the original promise of the internet, like that it's connecting people over long distances.
Yes, yes. We'll take whatever silver lining we can get from COVID-19, because certainly it has not been an easy road. And which leads me actually to my last question for you today, which is that, we're having this conversation in September 2020. So COVID-19 is still upending life as we know it. And so what are you reading right now to get through this moment? Like, is reading something that has been kind of like a balm for you, a bit of an escape, or yeah, what are you reading right now?
So I'm working on a new novel, so I have to sort of be careful with what I'm reading. And the novel takes place over the course of just a couple of days in Sicily at the onset of the Allied invasion. So I'm reading a lot of historical accounts of that time period. I'm reading a lot about Sicily, a lot about Italy during the Second World War. And I did a lot of online research and dug up declassified military documents about Operation Husky, which was the code name for the Allied invasion of Sicily, just so I could get a sense of where all of the fighting was happening, and the calendar of events. So, okay, how long is it going to take for the British to get from Pacino in the south up past Siracusa to Melilli? Because I kind of need to know that to make things line up as accurately as I can in the book. But just as important as what I am reading is what I'm not reading right now. And I learned early on that it benefited my mental health to start the day with a book rather than reading the news. Starting with the news became all consuming for me and depressing to the detriment of my productivity. So I always read a book in the morning with my coffee. And I hope that's a habit that I can continue in a post-pandemic world if we ever get there. Yeah. So that's sort of how I'm dealing with that.
Yeah, and what a beautiful both image and like potential habit to end on, right? Is this idea of starting your day with a book, starting your day with fiction. I feel like I've heard about other writers starting their day with poetry, to sort of like get that really refined bit of language before they go to their own writing, if they're writing a novel. And yeah, and I mean, and then if it's a great day, for me, I would start my day with a book and just go all day. I have found it certainly in my COVID-19, when on the worst days, I just pick up I call them cotton candy novels that I just like fly through in a day. And I'm like, I just find a really good cotton candy novel and I just go all the way through. So yes. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing your reading right now. Thank you for writing the next book. And thank you so very much for writing How Fires End. Marco Rafalà, thank you for this conversation today.
Thank you. Have a good day.